paying premiums as high as $30,000 a year with a high deductible. So we're going to do those. Because it didn't happen in a special session, you should see that as the #1 bill out of the House and Senate.
And how quickly? I mean, with all due respect, I mean, some of the families are paying significantly more than that. Families, $40,000 a year with a $13,000 deductible. How quickly can they expect relief from you? And how quickly can you get this all together? I mean, this is a crisis for these families.
Sure. Thank you, Esme. I think the problem that we will face is we'll have a new Congress and a new administration in Washington, D.C. They will unravel this. I think we all know that will not happen before we need to take action in reforming what we currently have here in Minnesota in order to have an impact on the policies that people buy on January 1st of 2018. We think that deadline is sometime in March. I'm not sure that we will know what the federal government is doing before that deadline. So there's a couple of things that they could do. One, kind of tilt your hand to us, let us know what you're thinking. Number two is on day one of the new administration, they could approve some waivers that would allow us to kind of restructure what we're doing here, some variances from the requirements of the federal law. One of those would be putting back in place some sort of a high-risk pool. I think everybody understands very, very clearly that that's what the main problem was. We had a small pool of people in the individual marketplace, and we threw the high-risk people into that pool, and it just skyrocketed the rates for everyone. So we have to somehow put in place either a reinsurance or a high-risk pool. It's going to take some time for us to do that. It's not going to happen overnight. So, but we need to take serious reform action by, I think probably I would shoot for the middle of March, but I think by the end of March, probably for sure, for us to really impact the policies that people are buying on January 1st of 2018. It's not going to be easy. So we need to kind of look for some clues of what the federal government's going to do and also ask for waivers from the federal government so they can let us get to work right away in setting something up here that'll work for Minnesotans.
But in terms of actual, some kind of rebate or relief, you're saying probably not until the end of March?
No, there's two parts. That's the long term, what I was just talking about. The short term, giving some premium relief, I think the senator said that I think everyone here supports giving premium relief to Minnesotans. Obviously our talks for a special session kind of fell apart last week. Our criticism of the governor is, number one, he waited too long to tell us about the problem. He knew about the problem back on May 1st. He waited until almost October 1st, September 30th, before he told us how bad the problem was. And by then it was too late for the legislature to take any substantive, meaningful reforms that could have affected things for January 1st of 2017. Number two, his plan, I called, what was that? I don't even remember the word that I used. It didn't go far enough. He is doing the absolutely minimum thing that we could do for Minnesotans. And the thing that he has said is that it's what we can implement. Well, they don't have to do anything. All they have to do is write a check when the plans send an invoice. The state would have to do nothing to implement his plan. Nothing. I think we owe Minnesotans more than to just give them the absolute bare minimum. We must do premium relief. But the governor's also not being honest. His premium relief will likely not take place or not impact, that money won't show up in people's pockets until April 1st. I think people are going to want help sooner than that. And it's not just the money, but we have to deal with the access part too. We have people that are potentially getting life-saving cancer treatments at Mayo Clinic that because of their new policies, that will stop on January 1st. I think there are things we can do to ensure some continuity of care so people can continue those, even if it's for 90 days, to help those people through until we can get into the legislative session and hopefully take further action that can help them right now. But throwing people out of their potentially life-saving cancer treatments is going to be a recipe for disaster. And we also have the situation where people in greater Minnesota are driving an hour or 2 hours past 1, 2, 3 clinics or hospitals to get to a clinic that will take their health insurance. That's unacceptable.
Well,
it's kind of a follow-up.
One follow-up here. I mean, Blue Cross Blue Shield pulled out in July. I mean, this wasn't as if everybody learned about this in October. Everyone
we didn't know about the caps, though, Esme. There was a lot of things we didn't know about this. Until, we didn't know how bad it was until September 30th.
Well, Senator Bakk, I mean, obviously in rural Minnesota, this is really hitting hard. I mean, what are your thoughts about this?
Well, I am a little interested to see how my Republican colleagues are going to handle this, because they had a lot of fun with it on the campaign trail. And now making the transition to governing and actually having to find some solutions is going to be really hard work. And, you know, the Senate last year, and I wish them the best, and we've got some good quality people in our caucus, I think, that are willing to roll their sleeves up and try to find some solutions. I hope we have a better outcome than last year, because, you know, this problem wasn't new. The Senate last year in our Health and Human Service bill had 4 or 5 reforms we thought that needed to be made to MNsure. And in conference, we couldn't get the House Republicans to consider any of them. So none of them happened. So this isn't new to us. This is one of the areas where we're absolutely willing to participate and try to find a solution. I've got a neighbor that's in that individual market, and he's the first one, a little self-employed CPA. He was the very first person that raised this issue with me when he came down the driveway and said, "Tom, what are we going to do?" Back in October when he found out what his premiums were going to be. So there are real faces on these 121,000 people or so, and I know some of them. And I hope we can avoid the partisanship at the legislature and with the governor and move beyond the campaign now and start to work hard on finding some solution, short and long term, for a serious problem in our state.
What's really frustrating to me is that we have within our power to provide immediate relief, and there's absolutely no good excuse for why we are not having a special session tomorrow to provide relief to families who need it right now. All 4 of us on December 2nd all agreed we're not crazy about relief without reform, but we all agreed that to help these families, this was something we're willing to live with in the short term. And the idea that these families have to wait 4 months for even some sort of the outlines of an answer is inexcusable. I think when we have it within our power to help Minnesotans and we don't help Minnesotans, there's no excuse for that. That's our job. What's really frustrating is to hear the speaker talk about the governor's plan as minimum. Well, if what the governor is proposing is minimum, he's below the minimum because he's not proposing any relief anytime soon. So, you know, the governor put forth more than 80 pages of very specific outline of exactly what would be entailed in the special session. And all we've heard as a reason of why we're not doing it is just complaints. We've never seen a written counteroffer, and particularly on the premium relief, I have not heard a single reason why we shouldn't do this tomorrow.
Speaker Daudt, we have a couple follow-up questions, but you seem to not be liking what you're hearing right now.
I mean, we just have to be accurate. Immediate relief is not relief that takes place on April 1st. And at best, based on what the plans are telling us, you could maybe say that if everything went perfectly, Minnesotans would get relief on March 1st. Still not immediate, okay? But that's best case scenario. And based on the track record of the administration over the last 4 years, I think it's safe for me to say when the plans say 8 to 12 weeks, I'll take the 12-week one just so we don't overpromise to Minnesotans. That's why I say April 1st. That's a very realistic number. The governor said February 1st. There isn't a soul on the planet, including the plans, who are saying they can get this done by February 1st. Can't happen, okay? That's a lie. That's not true. And we shouldn't tell Minnesotans that they're going to have relief on February 1st when there isn't a chance in the world that they will get it. That's letting Minnesotans down, okay? And to say that we didn't put a plan forward, it just isn't accurate. I mean, we had 5 proposals or provisions that we had talked about for months. We had specific language in bill format that we gave to the governor that would have helped people with the access part of this, continuity of care for 90 days, and other pieces that would have helped Minnesotans right away on January 1st. Now they're going to have a little delay, but we can hopefully backdate that to January 1st so that people can continue their treatments at Mayo and other places, and make sure that we live up to the promises that were made. And let's not forget that when this thing was passed, and I know everybody wants to separate themselves, I hope folks noticed what the governor said on Friday, that this wasn't anything that Democrats in Minnesota and the governor did, that this was something the federal government imposed and we just implemented it here in Minnesota, and that MNsure isn't responsible for this, it's just the Travelocity. Go back, look at the tapes when this was passed on the House floor and on the Senate floor, at the promises that were made to Minnesotans. They were promised they were going to have lower cost coverage and better access and more choices. Neither of those things happened. Those are broken promises to Minnesotans, and I'm sorry, you can't pass the buck. The governor needs to step up and take more responsibility and show that he's being more aggressive to work towards solutions that are going to really help Minnesotans on January 1st. The word I was looking for, uninspiring. His plan is uninspiring, and it's not going to help Minnesotans on January 1st. It's the least that that the state can do to help Minnesotans, the least.
Okay, let's talk about January, and I think this kind of constitutes a follow-up. Do I have to, I'll introduce myself. Mary LaHammer, Twin Cities PBS. So what is House File and Senate File 1? Is it MNsure and healthcare?
Yes.
Both of you have decided
Yes.
that in House and Senate? Okay, and then another follow-up to Don's
We
question.
didn't decide that, and we don't even have to look at each other
Yeah.
to both
You
say
already
yes.
know that.
Very
Okay.
obviously, that's the biggest issue that we have to deal with this session. We have to. It is a crisis for Minnesotans, and although we didn't create it, Minnesotans chose to go a different direction in the last election, and they chose us to fix the problem, and we will.
Okay, another follow-up. Don opened with the scenario last time we had this same composure of the governor's office and the legislature, an all-Republican legislature, a DFL governor, and constitutional amendments were popular. It's a way you can get around the governor. What is the appetite, particularly for the two Republican leaders, for any constitutional amendments?
On my part, I can say that we haven't talked about any constitutional amendments yet. I'm not saying we won't do them, but unless we have 34 people that agree that that's a good idea, we're not going to do it. And the two that came forth last time were both very controversial. And we know that we have, with just 34, you have to get a lot of other things done first, in my opinion. And so that's what we're going to focus on. Everywhere I've gone, I've talked about we're going to focus on the main thing being the main thing. And that's the health care reform and relief, a transportation bill without a gas tax increase, and hopefully tax relief. Those are some things that we consistently talk about that we want to do.
Mr. Speaker, isn't it tempting to work around the governor and do constitutional amendments?
You know, and I agree with the senator. We have not had that conversation, and I have not had anyone approach me saying, hey, we just absolutely have to do this constitutional amendment now that we have the majority. I think my caucus is focused on, number one, reforming the health insurance and MNsure, getting some help to folks who are suffering because of that. Number two, we've got to set a state budget that prioritizes, things that we all care about as Minnesotans, and part of that will be some tax relief for Minnesotans. It's been 2 years since we've had a tax bill, and the governor has done all he can to block tax relief back to Minnesotans, but it's overdue. We do have a surplus in the state budget, and I think Minnesotans deserve to get some of their money back.
Democrats,
Can I make
minority,
one
yes.
comment on that first, too? I mean, the tax bill, I was on the tax conference committee, and Senator Bach and I were on the tax committee itself, but that tax bill was the most bipartisan bill I think I've ever seen for a tax bill. You had, I believe, 89% of all legislators, House, Senate, Democrat, Republican, sign it. So, I mean, and get it to the governor. And so that was frustrating for us. I don't think it was, I'm just surprised that we couldn't get that one done, and so we'll keep working towards that.
Could I get the minority leaders to weigh in too? You both were around last time we had constitutional amendments and government shutdowns and that whole environment. What would be your fear of working around the governor and Republicans perhaps going straight to the voters on issues?
Well, I think if I could give them some advice, I wouldn't rule out the idea of constitutional amendments, but I think what they should think about is constitutional amendments that might be related to good government. And I was reminded myself when I turned over my ballot on November 8th and I saw all those judges. And one was opposed, and I didn't know anything about any of them, and I'm an elected official. And so there's been one floating around on judicial retention that I think Senator Rest has been the author in the Senate. I'm still interested in that. Frankly, the reason that we didn't try push it in the Senate is we couldn't find any traction in the House under Democratic control in 13-14 or under Republican control in 15-16. And I'm sure there are others, so I guess I would just like them to think about, are there some good government things that we could probably pretty bipartisanly agree on? That's the one I would suggest they take a look at.
In that vein, a redistricting commission would probably be a pretty good idea to look at. I say that without authorization of my caucus. But when you look at the failure of the political process here in Minnesota to use the political process to draw maps, it makes sense to put that in the hands of disinterested, data-conscious people and not politicians.
Tom Hauser from Channel 5. Speaker Daudt, you said last week that there would not likely be a bonding bill in the coming session. Can you again explain your rationale for that? And I'd like reaction from everybody else about whether there should be a bonding bill.
Obviously, that's up to our caucus. Our priority this first year of the biennium is going to be on reforming health care and setting a state budget, providing some tax relief. It's not traditionally a bonding year. I know you all know that. Although we have done smaller bonding bills in the first year of the biennium for some time. You know, the governor made some choices last week in what I think was a deliberate effort to scuttle a special session. We had, you know, he stood before you on December 2nd and told you what was going to be handled and dealt with in a special session. We put up what I called guardrails and asked others to go to work and negotiate the details of those bills. If folks are wondering what compromise looks like in St. Paul, I'll tell you what the governor's compromise looks like. In that bonding bill, he was requesting that we take all of the transportation projects out of the bill that we had put in, and he wanted all of his projects left in the bill. And then in his letter last Tuesday, he actually threw in quite a few additional projects that some had never been talked about before, and some had been off the table for 6 months. I can't look at what he did and what he put in that letter and come to any other conclusion than to say that he was deliberately trying to stop a special session from happening. And let me go one step further. By stopping a special session from happening, he was stopping that bonding bill. I don't know what he would tell you if he was here, if he would tell you it wasn't big enough. He wasn't getting enough of what he wanted. He was basically getting everything he wanted in his proposal. But he deviated so far from what we had talked about. That's what blew up the negotiations. Whether we have one or not in the next year is going to be a matter for, you know, our new bonding or capital investment chair and members of his committee, and for our caucus to decide if there are things that we need to do. I would guess if we do one, it'll be a smaller one, but I don't know, and we'll work through that process. But I also think the governor sent a pretty clear message by his efforts that he wasn't interested in a bonding bill.
Senator Gazelka, do you agree, or are there projects that your constituents want and that shouldn't be hung up due to politics?
So we're open to a bonding bill, but it would be end of session, and somehow I think it will be tied to tax relief and a tax bill, just as I understand how politics works. And it'll be unique in the Senate that we need 41 votes and we have 34 Republicans, so Senator Bach and I will be working on what should be in there if we're going to have one.
My suggestion would be, the governor, I think, said he was going to submit a bonding bill to us, I think he said in the first week or so. My suggestion would be they take that bonding bill to the appropriate committees and have hearings on it. There is not a lot going to happen at the legislature until the February budget forecast comes out, which is like March 1st. There's a bunch of new members that are going to get their orientations to all of the state departments and their committees, and that's very important. But I do think there's ample time to start working on a bonding bill before the February budget forecast comes out. I think if we could find a bipartisan agreement and pass one, I think Minnesota would be well served. You know, we're going to fall $1 billion behind now in investment in public infrastructure, and coming out of the construction industry, I can just tell you those projects aren't going to get cheaper. We decide to wait 2 years to pass it. We're not only going to get behind, projects are going to get more expensive. So I would encourage them to take the governor's proposal seriously, take it through the committee process, modify it how you want. But I think passing one sooner is better. I think getting it wrapped up in the end of session negotiations just make concluding the whole budget that much more difficult.
I think if the speaker was really interested in passing a bonding bill in special session, he had a really simple solution. It's called written counteroffer. The governor made a very clear 80-page explicit offer of precisely what would be included in the special session, and never got any written counteroffer. We don't pass conversations. We don't pass conversations whether they have guardrails or concepts in them. We pass bills. And so if you can't write down your proposed deal on a piece of paper, then it's not a deal. And I don't know how seriously we should take complaints that don't come with a written counteroffer.
Well, I like to take people at their word, and I think we were all there when the governor stood on December 2nd and said, this is how we are going to work this process. We have a guideline of what we think this looks like, but we're going to leave it up to the committee chairs and the commissioners to work out the details of what that will look like. The governor is the one that deviated from that. We didn't agree on December 2nd, and it was the governor's own words that said we weren't going to fire offers back and forth. So obviously we didn't start firing offers back and forth until we could play politics on where in the world were the legislative leaders and try to make some political hay out of that. Minnesotans expect better. And I don't think we want political games. I think we want solutions. And you know, we talked about how we were going to work that out, and it was the governor that deviated from that, unfortunately.
So negotiations going to be done in public?
Yes. Yep. In rooms that look just like this. It'll be great. You will have access to all of it.
All four of you agree?
I recommend that the offers and counteroffers be put in writing so that we know exactly what the proposed deal is, because the problem that we ended up with at the end of session last year is the Speaker and the Senate Majority Leader thought they had a deal that couldn't be reduced to a writing. It didn't stand up the process of getting written down.
Senator Gazelka is moving up to the microphone.
Well, I'm certainly willing to have everything in open. I think people like that. Would I ever say that I would go behind a closed door with the governor and talk turkey? I might.
Senator Bach, advice?
Well, I mean, Senate Democrats are willing to play whatever role we're asked. We're in the minority here, and if Senator Gazelka wants me to be part of that negotiation process that he has with the House and the governor, I'm willing to do that. If the governor asks, I'm willing to do that.
Kevin Fedley, Capital Report and Politics in Minnesota. On this very question, I'd like to ask in a slightly different way. What we saw Friday appeared less a set of negotiations done in public and more like a publicly arranged marital spat. Is that really the way to conduct business? Is that the way to go about this? These kinds of performances?
Well, you know, one of my frustrations has been the fact that the governor does not participate in the legislative session. I can't tell you how many times the governor has sent his commissioners to committee hearings, and when asked, they will say, well, I'm not authorized to make that decision. The commissioners are the governor's voice in the legislative process. The Constitution defines when we start and when we end the legislative process. He doesn't get to, and I kind of, in an effort to demonstrate my frustration, took to saying, you know, the governor's latest number one priority, or his, you know, his second or third number one priority, because he will show up with a week. I mean, in the last 2 years, one time it was, in fact, 2 years ago, it was all-day pre-K that didn't pass the House, didn't pass the Senate, and here we were with 4 days to go, and it was his number one priority. And then before we were done, there was another number one priority. The legislative process starts on January 3rd. He's going to outline his budget and his priorities through that process. It's going to be the governor's responsibility to gain support for those in the legislative process. And that's going to happen through the normally constitutionally defined process that we have here in St. Paul, in public hearings, in, you know, I think the problem is the governor has tried to overplay his hand in the past by not agreeing to things, by using the clock and trying to force people into a negotiation on special session. 8 times in the last 2 years, the governor has called for a special session. He's closed the deal once. He's 1 for 8. I think it's time that we stop relying on special sessions and start participating in the regular session, and that's my advice to the governor.
If I could, I'd like to just follow up on that. I'd like to hear from the others. Is that what you envision as a public negotiation, that kind of an incident? I would almost call it an incident, almost an accident.
No, and I want to answer to that too. You know, the governor, that's what tells me that someone's not serious. When people are firing letters back and forth, and by the way, every time the governor sends me a letter, you have it before I do. Not on accident. You're not, none of you are new to this. You understand what's going on. That's posturing for the public, not solving problems. And this is a relationship business. I started my comments today by saying that we did have somewhat of a damaged relationship. We do. And the governor's going to need to fix that if he's going to want his last 2 years in office to be successful. He's, one of the other leaders here has said that he could be viewed as a lame duck governor at this point. The voters took the legislature in a much different direction in the last election because they didn't like some of the hallmark policies that the governor put in place in his first 6 years. He's going to need to, it's going to be incumbent on him if he wants to accomplish his goals to participate in that process. And that meeting on Friday was set up in front of the press not to get to a conclusion, but to have a little dog and pony show for the media. And it wasn't even, no one should call that a negotiations. It wasn't.
That had the potential to be a productive meeting if it would have been preceded by a written counteroffer. I talked to the speaker that morning, well, actually the morning before, and I said, if you were trying to sell me your car and you said, Representative Hortman, I think my car is worth $3,500. And I said, no, I think it's worth $2,500. And then you said, no, well, I think it's at least $3,000. You know what I would say then? I'd say sold. That's how you get to a deal. I told the speaker, what the governor just put on the table was $3,500. Why don't you put $2,500 on the table and let's see if we can see $3,000. Let's see if we can get there. But in order to identify where the disagreement is, we don't need an itemized litany of complaints about how somebody's being treated. We need specific projects written down on a piece of paper. These are the ones we're willing to fight for. These are the ones of your.
Given that there's still some degree of divided government in Minnesota, or is that issue just have to go to the background with more important issues like the budget and health care to deal with?
Who do you want to answer?
You can start with the speaker.
Okay. I'm optimistic that we can. Obviously, the number one issue, and I don't think anybody's going to disagree, has to be dealing with the healthcare crisis, health insurance crisis. But transportation, and there's a funding cliff that's coming that we need to deal with as well. So the issue is becoming more and more important. Obviously, there were some pretty differing ideas on how to approach this in the last biennium, or the current biennium, if you will. The governor, at a time when Minnesota families weren't seeing the sort of surplus that the state government was seeing, his answer was the largest gas tax increase in state history. I think that sort of approach was rejected in the last election. And people in Minnesota, particularly in greater Minnesota, really aren't, they aren't saying to themselves, I just can't wait to pay more taxes. What they'd like is an economic recovery that will help their families in their own situation. I think the thing that ultimately doomed any transportation agreement in the last biennium, however, was the drastic overreach on the part of transit. They weren't asking for a 10 or a 20% increase in transit funding, or even a 50% increase, or even a 100% increase, or 120, or 150, or 180, or 200. They weren't asking for a 220, 240. They were asking for a 260% increase in transit funding. Okay? That was the problem. It was just such a drastic overreach. Sorry for naming all those numbers off, but I think people would say, boy, a 50% increase sounds like a lot. What does a 260% increase in transit funding sound like? So that they can build out their dream transit system.
Let's move to next legislative session, not rehash history, please. What's going to happen?
Well, we're hopeful that we can get a transportation package, but the reason I was setting the table for that is it's going to take people being realistic. We understand that we need transit in the state of Minnesota. It's important in greater Minnesota just as it's important in the metro area, and we understand that people rely on that. But we need to be reasonable about what we ask for. We also know that folks out in greater Minnesota want some investment in our road and bridge infrastructure. We tried to do that some with the bonding bill. And we think we can do that within the surplus dollars that are available. We put a plan on the table in the last 2 years that we thought was much more reasonable and much more acceptable. And we'll look at something along that line again. We've got new chairs, so I want to give them an opportunity to kind of start working on this and have some hearings to wrap their mind around what approach they want to take before I get too committal to any specific plan, but we're optimistic.
Yeah, I'll be surprised if we don't get a transportation bill done with permanent funding without raising taxes, using present money. What finished in the House at the end could easily be similar to where we are today, but just like the Speaker said, the Senate also has a number of new senators. We have a new transportation chair, and we're going to want their input, but there's no reason that we cannot get it done.
Well, it's hard. And the public wants the roads and bridges fixed. They just don't want to pay for it. You can look at all the polling data. I mean, it's a pretty simple disconnect. And in the Senate, we've tried. You know, we tried to convince a Democratic House in 2013 to do something permanent with dedicated funding for roads and bridges, and couldn't get a Democratic House to do it. In 2015, we tried to do it in the Senate and couldn't get a Republican House to do it. So I guess I'm looking forward to the proposal and seeing if it's not new money, who does it come from, right? I mean, there's X number of dollars available in this budget, and this legislature is going to decide what the priorities are and what the most important urgent needs are. And I've never supported the idea, as much as I want to fix roads and bridges, I've never supported the idea of taking it away from K-12 schools. I just haven't, and I hope that's not where we end up. But that's just spoken as a grandparent who really cares about our K-12 school system, who has 7 grandchildren that are oldest one in first grade. Their future is going to be determined largely by the education that this legislature is willing to help pay for. So I just would add some caution if we're going to look at existing resources. What kind of goes on the cutting room floor in order to be able to do that?
Representative Hortman?
Just to focus your response level, the Speaker criticized transit funding, and particularly what he called the exorbitant increase in transit funding, where Democrats have traditionally pushed for transit funding, including in the last year. Is a significant increase in transit funding a necessity for Democrats to sign on board to any such package?
Democrats like road, bridge, and transit funding. What we like is a balanced package that serves all of Minnesota. The last time we passed a transportation finance bill in Minnesota was in 2008 over a recalcitrant governor's veto, and it was balanced. It was very substantial investment, mostly in bridges. We have no more fracture critical bridges in the state of Minnesota because we got the resolve together to address that problem. But I think Senator Bach makes a really good point that when you look at the existing budget and you want to use existing resources, I sure would hate to see a cut target go to K-12, and I would hate to see a cut target go to HHS. We're talking about people in our community who have the most difficulty with their day-to-day daily activities of living, and typically when we see Republicans in charge of the House, we see a cut target, and that hurts people who are already the most vulnerable. So I, like Senator Bach, would agree that if we're really serious about doing something about the roads, our first preference would be long-term, stable, dedicated transportation funding that doesn't take money from school children or people with disabilities or people in nursing homes.
Tom Hauser again, just as a follow-up to that, by taking money from school children, are you talking about diverting existing sales taxes that would usually go to the general fund, or explain what permanent funding you're talking about? Senator Gazelka, you mentioned you think it can happen without raising taxes. Tell us specifically how that would be done.
Well, first of all, we have a $1.4 billion surplus and a surplus moving forward, and so I'm looking at that as one of the places that we invest the money. I've been in the majority in the House in 2005, and Republicans had that, and we gave the largest per pupil funding, I think, maybe 20, 30 years, 4% each year, and we didn't get credit for that. And the last time around that we had the majority, we didn't cut education funding then. And so, you know, I think all 4 of us think that education funding is important. So, but we do have a surplus, which means what are we going to do with some of that? And we talked about the healthcare crisis. Certainly roads and bridges and figuring out how to fund that would be a good opportunity to use that for.
That would be a one-time. What about permanent, ongoing funding?
Well, I will tell you that each of our chairs will look at every like health or K-12 or higher ed or whatever, and where are we spending our money, how are we spending our money? And we haven't looked at that in a while. Last 4 years, spending has gone up, I believe, 18%, so it's not like we've been cutting anything, it's been growing. And I want to make sure that we're using the dollars wisely. I can tell you that Senator Abler wants to take a real hard look at our human resource delivery and what are we doing. Is it efficient? Not the dollars going to the people that need it, but what the dollars are before they even get to them and how we're doing that. And so, so that would be one of the areas that I'm going to be looking to. Can we save money and still provide the services that we're giving to those people?
I just, as a follow-up, I'm still unclear on what specific funding sources for transportation you will look at. You're talking about surplus, you're talking about savings elsewhere in state government. Seems to me that still isn't going to be enough, and I'd like everybody to chime in on this.
I do think that will be enough.
Speaker Daudt, do you agree?
General fund, and that's been the problem. Nobody has wanted to spend general fund money on roads and bridges. Well, it's very difficult to go out and tell Minnesotans that when we have, in the last biennium, a $2 billion surplus, but we need you to kick up the money that you put in when you put your gas in the tank every day. I think Democrats broke some promises to Minnesotans in the last biennium. The governor went out and said, I'm going to tax the wealthy and they're going to pay their fair share. But he proposed increasing, he actually got one of them increased, the most hurtful taxes to lower income folks. And number one, it was the cigarette tax, raised at $1.60 a pack, much more disproportionately affects low-income Minnesotans. The other one is the gas tax. So it's very difficult to say to Minnesotans, we have a $2 billion surplus. We're collecting more money than we need from you, and now we need you to kick in more so we can pay for, by the way, the constitutionally defined core functions of state government. To me, the core functions get paid for before everything else. So we're going to use some general fund money to pay for our roads and bridges. And you know why? Because that's what Minnesotans expect us to do with the money that they give us. They want it to pay for the basics. So we've got enough money there to deal with the problem.
Mike McEntee from the Uptake. I'd like to talk about elections just for a moment, since a lot of people are thinking
I'm sorry,
about
can we
that.
just have, I'd like to hear from the minority as well. Senator Bach, could you just chime in on what you think about this?
I think there's been about 15 times in the state's history that transportation has been on the ballot. And there's a reason that previous legislatures have always put that on the ballot, because they've all known that unless you constitutionally dedicate that money, or unless you constitutionally build like the highway system, you can't bind future legislatures. And this legislature might be well-intentioned to put some general fund money into roads and bridges, but you can't bind the next one unless it's constitutional. And the highway system has always been a user fee system. It's why license tabs, the sales tax on motor vehicles, the gas tax, all are constitutionally dedicated to transportation, so that future legislatures can't undo a long-range transportation plan because it's constitutionally guaranteed. So I just would add some caution. It might be a priority today to the legislature or to the voters, that maybe transportation is the #1 thing on people's minds right now, and maybe that's where they want the general fund money spent. But a transportation plan is more than a 2-year proposal. And we might all be sitting here 2 years from now, and the public's attitude about what's important might have radically changed, depending on circumstances totally unknown to us today. So I just would continue to urge caution. I've had little luck in the past with Republicans and Democrats, including the governor back in 13 and 14, that it needs to be a constitutionally dedicated revenue stream. And if they decide at the end that they want to put something on the ballot to constitutionally dedicate those sales taxes on tires or auto parts or whatever, might be something I'm even willing to support. But if you're going to permanently dedicate general fund money to transportation, please consider doing it constitutionally so that the 20-year transportation plan that's developed can actually be executed and is not left to the whim of the next legislature to just not be a priority.
Did you have any addition?
I agree with Senator Bach. I mean, I think when you have a general fund budget and you have kindergartners competing with transportation funding, the kindergartners are usually going to win that fight. And that's why in 2008, when we put that package together, we worked so hard to have responsible, long-term, dedicated transportation funding.
Mike McEntee from the Update. I wanted to talk just quickly about elections because a lot of people are, of course, talking about that today. Senator Mary Kiff-Myers indicated that at some point during the biennium, she plans to address the issue of requiring voters to use a photo ID to vote. And given that we just had a constitutional amendment fail, I think, in 2012 by at least a majority of Minnesotans, is this a wise thing to raise again, Senator Gazelka? That would be your area, I believe.
Well, first of all, I was in that press conference, and it wasn't something I think she was ready to talk about, but they asked, and that was something she'd like to do. But she also added, I think rather forcefully, that she knows that we have to focus on the things that we all have been talking about, the healthcare crisis, roads and bridges, tax relief. You know, so that is not, I know it's important to her. I don't know that it's a high priority for her. Her high priority is the same things that we talked about that we all have to work on. So the other thing I would say about that is unless we have 34 strong in the Senate that want to go that route, then it's not going to happen.
So it's not a high priority for you, then?
It's not something that I've even discussed other than that press conference with anyone.
Speaker Daudt in the House?
It's not something that we have talked about either, and I don't know that it will be a high priority for us. But I have to just on a personal level say I think it's the most common sense thing in the world. You have to have a driver's license to get welfare benefits or you know, a plethora of other things. And I think, you know, valuing your vote and my vote means that nobody else gets to cast a vote who's not supposed to, because then it devalues your vote and my vote. So I think our election process is important. It's somewhat unique in the world, and I think we need to protect it, but we have not had any conversations about passing anything like that. I think there's other things that can be done to you know, make sure that our elections are sound as well. And we have some other election problems we have to deal with. We have a special election that is happening now because a district was determined that a member didn't live in their district, and they were removed from the ballot. The problem now becomes we're not filling the seat, and we're leaving that seat sit empty for a month and a half with no representation. And I think it doesn't take too creative of a mind to figure out you can misuse that. In fact, they could file somebody in my seat against me that doesn't live in my district, and then once the filing period is closed, have that person have it challenged by themselves, have that person removed, and all of a sudden the Speaker of the House isn't sworn in with the rest of the House on January 1st. So there's a huge potential for that statute to get misused, and I don't think anybody saw that when we passed it a couple of years ago. So there's a fix that we definitely have to do there, and I think there's some other things in the elections that we need to work on as well, and they probably should be non-controversial, bipartisan things.
The other thing in elections that people are, of course, talking about today is the presidential electors and joining the compact so that the majority vote winner, popular vote winner, gets Minnesota's 10 electoral votes. What are your thoughts on those?
I will introduce again my bill to distribute electoral votes by congressional district, the way I think a couple of states do. I think Nebraska and is it Maine that does it that way? I think there's two. I think that makes more sense for us if we want Minnesota to be on the campaign trail for the presidential election. I just personally don't support changing, you know, or entering into some creative way to get around our federal constitution to you know, distribute or change the Electoral College to a national popular vote. It's not. The Electoral College was put in place for a reason, and you know, I think we can change the way we distribute our own electoral votes, which the Constitution gives us the right to do, but I don't think an end around on our federal Constitution is in the spirit of what our founding fathers had in mind.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that?
They probably don't.
Well, let me just say on the issue of election changes, the governor has been pretty clear that he's not going to sign election or campaign-related bills unless there's bipartisan support at the legislature. And the reason I remember that is then Speaker Thiessen and I wanted to do some things in 2013 and 14 when we had Democratic control in the governor's office and in the House and Senate. And the governor was very clear with us when we met with him that he's not going to sign election bills that don't have bipartisan support. So we made a decision not to send them to him because we couldn't find something we could find bipartisan support for. So that would be my advice. Reach out to the governor if there's some election reforms you want to make. I would be surprised if his position on that has changed.
Maybe moving the primary up earlier, who knows?
Could you all actually
Find
address
bipartisan
June
support.
primary? Could you all address June primary? There's some supporters at this panel. Is this the year for it? And as long as I'm here, Sunday sales. We doing Sunday sales this year?
What do you want to ask?
Well, let me start. I'm going to vote no on Sunday sales and yes on June primary. Consistent position I've had.
I've generally been no on Sunday sales, but I really want to see what our caucus thinks on that, and stay tuned. And June primary, I don't have a huge opinion on that. I liked it a little later so that there was more opportunity to get your message out, but again, that's not something that I'm passionate about.
I think that we're going to pass Sunday sales out of the House this year. I've had some conversations with my members prior to them being appointed to the Commerce Committee. So I think you might see some changes not only in that committee, but in the House itself. I think it's just past time. If a liquor store doesn't want to be open on Sunday, they don't have to, but customers, consumers, our constituents would like them to have that flexibility and frankly would like them to be open. So I predict that we will pass that out of the House this year. June primary, I obviously have been a supporter. I was the chief author the last few times around, and we almost got it passed, I think 4 years ago. Ended up getting hung up over in the Senate, but...
No. Don't rewrite history, Mr. Speaker. Both the party chair of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party came to the legislature and said, don't do this to us. So
well, they both support it now.
They were both against it then.
They both support it now.
I'm open-minded on Sunday sales. I've always been a no because it is a way to bring in big box retailers and really put small businesses at a disadvantage. But I am regularly, if not daily, lobbied on this issue by my husband. So I'm pretty open-minded about getting it taken care of. And then with regard to June primary, I'm open-minded as well. Out of deference to my colleagues from the rural parts of the state, I have generally voted against it because the idea of me having a challenger in Brooklyn Park or Coon Rapids is one thing, but the idea of Senator Bach having a challenger up north is a totally different situation when you're looking at a June primary. But I think we'll have to talk to our caucuses and see where they are.
On another drinking subject, the four of you can feel free to sit back and take some sips out of your Wilmer bottled water in front of you. I want to take a moment to the reporters. We're getting on the home stretch here, so if you have questions, you're going to need to be waving your hands at me. And while I'm talking, probably go the rest of the 20 minutes, but I want to thank the Senate Sergeant at Arms Office for setting all this up and Senate Media Services for providing live streaming both on their website and for Forum Communications websites. They do the work, I just sit here. As you all know, that's what I do best. Other reporters, Kyle, identify yourself, please.
Kyle Potter, Associated Press. To the Republican leaders at the table, the governor and the Met Council came up with a funding workaround for Southwest Light Rail. Does that make transportation easier in 2017, and do you plan to block or challenge that funding mechanism?
I'm not sure. I think they are intent to move forward, but I'm not sure at the end of the day that they will. I know Met Council came out just recently, I think within the last couple of weeks, if I remember right, and said that they have a fairly large operating deficit projected for, I think it was next year. I don't remember all the details, but something in the $80 million range. So I think we should perfect what we're doing now before we bite off more than we can chew, and I think that's a good, it isn't about being pro-transit or anti-transit. It's just let's grow at a rate that we can afford and that we can that's sustainable. And I think there are going to be some challenges for Met Council in the next couple of years if they're not able to operate what they have now and they want to do more. It's going to be difficult. And anybody with common sense would come to that conclusion. So my guess is they'll probably take a second look at moving forward with Southwest Light Rail.
So first of all, if Southwest Light Rail is moving forward on a separate track, no pun intended, then, well, actually it was intended, but I think the rest of the transportation bill is, I think, much easier to work on. I think all of us here support bus transit. It's really just been Southwest Light Rail and things like that. So if that's off on a different track, then I think it's far easier to get a transportation bill done.
I'll also just chime in if I can really quickly on, I'll remind the local governments, whether it be CTIB and the partner counties that are part of that, or Met Council, you made a decision to proceed with the capital investment on this project without the legislature. We believe that's a violation of state law. But you made a decision to make the capital investment. My hope is that you did that with the knowledge that you know where the operating money is coming from as well. You can fill in the blanks.
Okay, a question from a Greater Minnesota reporter.
Trey Muse, Mankato Free Press. I know a lot of people in my neck of the woods are concerned about the $90 million farmland tax credit that was in the tax bill last year. Is that going to be part of tax legislation this year?
Your farm property tax or ag relief? Yeah, that for me personally is a very high priority. As ag prices or ag land has gone up, their portion of the taxes have gone sky high, and we looked at a number of ways to solve that, passing that on to the local businesses or the local residents, and we just couldn't find something that everybody could agree on. I'm not sure it was the best policy in the world, but I think that it was a way to provide ag property tax relief that everybody could sign off on was the solution. So I personally definitely support that. I'm working with our tax chair now, and we're combining what are the things that we want to accomplish in a tax relief bill, but that would be very, very high priority for me personally.
Yeah, I agree. I think we'll see it in whatever tax bill comes forward. Yeah.
Well, let me just say on that, it's being framed up as ag property tax relief. But what it really was intended to do was help those small rural schools that have a lot of ag property in their districts so that they're able to pass voter-approved levies. And we've got school districts all over the place in the metro area here that are levying over $2,000 a pupil because the big buildings pay for it. And out in rural areas, it's the farmer that has the valuable land and can't afford the cost of voter-approved levies. So those schools are put at a huge disadvantage. So I think when we talk about that ag property tax relief, let's remember what we're doing is it's another credit in the rural area of the state to try and put some new money into their K-12 schools. And so it really has it's a good proposal because it's got really two good purposes that everyone supports.
I think it was very bipartisanly supported, and in the House, I'm sorry, bipartisanly is not a word, I know that.
Rachel?
Sorry about that. But my deputy, Paul Marquardt, who'll be sitting right next to me on the floor, I know will fight for that again this year.
I have, on continuing rural issues, I have two I'll ask in one. Rural child care is being called a crisis now because it's very difficult to find child care centers in much of rural Minnesota. And I know Representative Franzen's working on that, but I'd like to hear your opinions on what can be done there. And the other thing is rural workforce housing. It happens in the urban areas too, but you don't have to drive as far as you do out in the center box area. If you have a new factory or something, there are some places that they can't get enough housing for the jobs that are open. I'd like to know from all four of you what can be done, what you think will be done this session, if anything.
Well,
Senator
Gazelka can speak to this better than I can, but the Coalition of Greater Minnesota Cities had a proposal last year that ended up in the tax bill, or some version of it was in that tax bill, to try and buy down some of the cost of the development of workforce housing in rural communities. I support that. It's a priority to me. In my own personal case up in Cook County, up in Grand Marais, I mean, we have significant housing problems. Housing is very expensive up there because there's so little private land, and construction costs are high because it's so far away from everywhere. So it's a place where the traditional mortgage doesn't work. So I would like to take another look at what the Coalition of Greater Minnesota Cities was proposing, what ended up in the tax bill, and I think it should be part of a final bill this year also.
Yeah, so as Senator Bach talked about, it is part of the solution for getting job creators that want to expand out in rural Minnesota, as long as they can hire people that have a place to live. So the two really have to go together. I realize it's probably more of a rural than a metro issue, but it is a rural issue. And as far as daycare, a couple of things. First of all, we have a shrinking population out there, which already compounds finding employees and finding daycare providers, et cetera. But secondly, what we have to think about is we should not try to unionize them again. I think that really was just a ice bucket of water thrown on them. They really found that offensive, and we saw that in the vote. But adding to that, all the different regulations that we have on these people, it's typically a mom who wants to have a number of kids at home and, be home with her own kids and then have a group of people that she can take care of. And so if we're trying to expand that, we need to think about what are the regulations that we make it difficult for them to do what we all need them to do.
I think everybody knows that those are two areas where
I also want to say I've not served on the Capital Investment Committee, so it's not an area that I've been thinking about in any great detail.
On the issue of taxes, obviously Republicans now control the House and the Senate. Republicans are usually synonymous with tax cuts. What specific tax relief or tax cuts will you pursue in the House and Senate this year? And how difficult do you think that will be?
Well, first of all, I think we should take a look at the tax bill that should have passed and didn't, and we'll go through a number of things in there that, that there was bipartisan support for. There were some things that the House also had related to Social Security exemption that we certainly want to look at. We would have liked to have done. As far as the business property tax, it may include the inflator as well. It's an automatic every year increase in business property taxes regardless of what's going on. So those would be some things that I want to at least take a look at. But I would say let's first start with where we were, because there was a lot of agreement there. What are some of the things that we still have agreement, and then some of the other things I mentioned.
And Mr. Speaker, if you could also specifically address that, and also, will there be any attempt to roll back the upper income tax increases that went into effect a few years ago?
I don't foresee that this year, but I agree with what the senator said. I think we're going to take a look at the tax bill that was on the table. We want to make sure that we're giving money back to folks if we don't need it here in state government. And I think the fact that we've had surpluses now indicates that we're collecting more money than we need. So I personally like, I was a big proponent, as was Senator Bach. We actually worked on that together, the exempting the veterans retiree benefits. That was a big deal. And I actually personally would like to do the Social Security benefits. It's a bigger piece of the pie, but I think it's important that those folks, all we're doing is, it's tax dollars, we're paying them, and then we're taxing them on the tax dollars. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. Plus, I think, our folks that are living on Social Security income have not seen much of a COLA increase the last 4 years. So it would be nice for them to be able to have that income exempted from taxes. I also like the approach we took with the business, kind of targeting it at small business by exempting the first 100 or 150,000 of value for everyone on the statewide business property tax. I think that hit a lot of small mom and pop Main Street businesses out in greater Minnesota, but it also impacted every business in the state. So I think that was a good approach as well. And I also we don't like inflators. That's why the getting rid of the cigarette tax inflator and the getting rid of this inflator would be important. When Democrats are in the majority, they put tax increases in place and they put automatic inflators in case they lose the majority. Those taxes keep going up. I think that signs away the legislature's ability to do their job. And it's up to the legislature if they want to increase taxes to do it, and if they want to decrease taxes to do it. And we shouldn't put anything on an automatic pilot like that.
Well, just want to remind everybody, I don't know if you saw the USA Today results from, I think it's less than 2 weeks ago now, where the group 24/7 Wall Street announced that they had finished their most recent study, and that Minnesota was, from a fiscal standpoint, the second best state run in the country. That North Dakota was first, Minnesota was second from a fiscal perspective. Number of different criteria that go into that. New Mexico was 50th, Illinois was 49th. I didn't look at everybody that was in between there. But I mention that because this state does have very good fiscal health with a very, very nice budget reserve right now, that a provision that the Senate put in 2014. And just want to urge caution in the tax bill as it relates to phasing in proposals like Social Security going forward. I remember when we did the single sales ratio, and back in 2001, I believe, so the businesses only pay on sales they actually make in Minnesota. We phased that in over 14 years because these big tax changes like that, and a big tax change like exempting Social Security would have to be phased in over a number of years for us to afford it. So just be very careful that we don't overcommit future revenue. We are closer to the next recession than we are away from the last one. They come. So just be careful when phasing things in. On Social Security, just let me say, we treat Social Security income just like the federal government does. I think on a couple, we don't tax it until they get to about $35,000 in income. So let's just be careful. A whole lot of people are not paying taxes on their Social Security now. And so what I'd be interested in seeing is kind of the run of, if we did totally exempt Social Security completely, where does the money go? Because if no family of two people with under 35,000 income get a penny, where do those hundreds of millions of dollars go? So I think that's a good conversation, I think, for us all to have, and it might make sense. It might all go to the middle class who needs some help, but there's a lot of data to look at, and I just think people need to understand, and I think the public sometimes doesn't understand that we treat it the same way the federal government does right now.
My caucus will be looking at tax proposals to see how they are for Minnesota families. And if Minnesota families fare well, then we'll be supportive. But if the tax cuts go to special interests or just commercial or big businesses, then we're not likely to support them.
We're about out of time. Promise David, one last question. Don't take too much time on it.
I'll be brief. I will see if you guys can, because this is not an easy one. It touches both the intersection of both the budget, which is going to be contentious this year, and social issues, which are always contentious. For the Republicans in particular, are we going to see a push, and particularly a concerted, insistent push, on working the budget in terms of funding for Planned Parenthood, which has been an issue in a lot of years and could be a real sticking point potentially between the Republican-controlled legislature and Governor Dayton?
I can only speak for the Senate and simply say that we have not talked about it at all yet, one way or the other. And I like to say that nothing's off the table, but we are really going to do our best to focus on some of the main things that we've been talking about here. A number of groups have a number of issues that they would like to have us address, and we'll take them one at a time and see where our caucus goes.
Yeah, we have had no conversations about that, so I don't anticipate.
I think that would be a colossal mistake, as Planned Parenthood provides a tremendous service for women, a full range of healthcare services, not just women, women and men. And I think that in the state of Minnesota, we have seen really good results from increased availability of birth control. I think that's something that people on both sides of this issue should be able to support. So I think that would be a really big mistake for the health of Minnesotans, and particularly for the health of women in the state of Minnesota.
My first chance to digress from the question. Please don't cut higher ed. In 2011, higher ed, when we went home in May, was cut by 19%. And at the end of the shutdown in July of 11, higher ed ended up with a 14% real cut in their budget. We have some of the highest tuition in the country at our two-year colleges, second highest last time I looked. Student debt coming out of college is becoming a tremendous burden on people. And I mention it because it's the easiest place in the budget to cut, because you can cut and the institutions can backfill with tuition. So it's an easy cut to make, but our tuition is spiraling out of control, and we are going to put higher education out of the reach of just regular working class families.
There are a lot more issues we could talk about, but we have a whole legislative session to do it, and I guarantee you we'll be asking you these questions. But for now, Forum News Service thanks the four of you for sitting there on the hot seat today, and we look forward to it again. Let's do it again next year. Thank you all.
Thank you.
It's in the other room.
I wonder if I can get my picture taken today, I'm supposed to get it tomorrow. Okay.
Thank you very much for showing up here.
Thank you, Don. Appreciate you setting this up. Yeah,
Sure.
thank you.
We should do this every
One of these people.
You want?
Me?
Sure.
I haven't seen it yet, I put a little cover around what it's about, so I'll just send it over.
Well,
It's addressed to me properly, whatever, I don't even care what you do.
that's true.
See, I know.